So here is an AR representation of an N-body simulation. So I just wanted to show how easy it is to put together an AR diagram so that you can communicate science a little bit more easily or communicate whatever your ideas are a little bit easier. I think AR is very promising in that it can almost make what you imagine to be manifest. So you can kind of the things that you imagine onto the world, you can now place onto the world. And it's a really amazing technology, and it's also very easy to get started. So what I want to do here is just kind of go over some basic outlines of overall what AR is, and then I wanted to just show you some very simple code. It'll be less than 100 lines, and it'll get you started on creating an AR scene so that you can kind of build off of that. So to start off with AR, there's 4 central coordinate systems that you end up using. 2 that are in the real world, and then 2 that are in the virtual world. So starting off with the real world ones, you have the real world, that scene. The next one that you have is the real world camera. That'll be kind of your camera moving around. And one thing that makes this a little bit tricky is that the camera is actually going to be a non-inertial reference frame. So it's kind of accelerating and it's moving around. And that makes a lot of this a lot more complicated. And then on the virtual side, you kind of have the 2 things that are synonymous with this, and eventually you kind of want them to be the same reference frame. So you have the digital camera or the 3D camera in the 3D scene. And so those 2 coordinate systems, you want the 3D coordinate systems to match up with the real coordinate systems. And the reason why we're making this distinction is that when you do the mapping, when you try and get from the real world and then you try and overlay the digital world on top of that, oftentimes you can end up with errors. And so we want to make these distinguishing things so that we can notice what type of errors might arise. So if you have a failure in the mapping that does the orientation, then you'll end up with your 3D camera cycling out of control. So it'll just rotate around and around and around. The errors come up from some of the assumptions that you're making to make these calculations not following through. So for instance, WebXR or WebAR that we're going to be using makes an assumption about the camera and what information it has. So it assumes that your camera is viewing a static scene. And so it actually doesn't work very well in the dark. It doesn't work very well if there are large moving objects through the scene. So the code is going to involve HTML page and then a JavaScript file. So we'll start with the HTML page. Pretty straightforward, all the basics. Then what we want to do is we want to add in a viewport tag and just make it so that the user can't zoom in and out. And that can cause some kind of challenges if you have it with AR. So we're just going to take that out. And then we're going to load up 2 different scripts. We're going to load up 3JS, so that's going to be our 3D library. And we're going to load our script. And then finally, we're just going to add in some CSS. Okay, so we're going to start by making some global variables. We want our camera, we want our scene, and we want our render to all be global, so we'll just add those quickly. The next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to initialize the 3D scene. So we're going to want to write all of the 3JS inside of this init function that will build out our scene. So we're going to add the camera, the scene. We want the inner part of the camera to be very close because when you're doing AR, you need it to be very close. We're going to add a box. So our box is just going to be our reference object. And then we're going to add a renderer. So that will be the one thing that we need to remember about when we're doing XR is we actually have to enable it separately. So this is a pretty standard rendering function that we need to add it separately. And then we're just going to add a resizing function. And so the resizing function will just resize everything. After that, we're going to build out the function that will be open up AR session. So we'll just call it AR. We'll build, a lot of this is going to be code that is pretty cookie cutter. So we're just going to add some things that enable it. We're going to call a get XR session in it. So this is a function we're going to make in a moment. And then we also have to ask the navigator to request a session as well. So then we are going to add an event listener that's listening for the start of the event, for the start of the session. And that'll just change some of our stylings so that we can exit out of it easily. Then we are going to add the opposite. So when it ends, this will happen. And so now we're going to build the core of it, the get XR session in it. And so this is a lot of just kind of checks that we need to do and formatting so that we get the right session that we want. So it's a lot of boilerplate type stuff that is not super important for right now. Then we have to call our animation loops. This is going to be the thing that gets looped over and creates a bunch of information. And then we're going to call the init, the animate. So we'll start our 3D session, then we'll start animating it. And then we need to build out the button to get the XR going. And that's basically it. So we're just a little bit over 100 lines of code, and we have something that should be building an AR box, which is pretty impressive because now there's a few key parts of the code that we can look at for if we wanted to do different things. There's an animation loop that we can do. So that's the render function. If we put things in there, that'll be looped over every animation. In the init function, we can build different things at the very start. So we can add different 3D objects. And so we end up with a very kind of robust skeleton that we can use. Okay, so I just wanted to add a few caveats on things that might make it a little bit more difficult to implement this. So there's two kind of key ones. One is that you actually need an SSL certificate in order to use this API. And so that requires a little bit of work. You can do it with Let's Encrypt very easily. There's a lot of videos out there that show you how to implement this on a web page. It does make it a little bit challenging when you're trying to use AR for local network servers. That's a caveat. The other one is that you do need to be able to run a server. And so there's 2 or 3 different simple ways that you can set this up. So Python and JavaScript, those 2 languages have some very straightforward servers that can just get you up and running really quickly. So Node and Django come to mind. Flask is also a possibility. There's a lot of really easy servers that you can get up and running with an SSL certificate. But that's just something extra you will need to know how to do if you're planning on implementing this. And finally, a mini demo for what's to come. Okay.